My name's Pat Steadman. I'm the state senator for District 31. I live in House District 2, but very little of House District 2 actually overlaps District 31. If you live between 8th Avenue and Colfax in the Capitol Hill area, then I'm your guy, which happens to be where Alec Arnett and I both live. So. I've got a little story I kind of want to tell, and you've been reading about it in the paper, but I want to respond to one of the questions that was asked earlier. Robin, don't leave, because this gentleman asked about the state law about whether or not municipalities can offer Wi-Fi service and internet. And actually, you may do that now with voter approval. That's what the current state law says. And that was set up by the Comcasts and the CenturyLinks, or before it was CenturyLink, actually. I think it was still Quest back when that law passed. And that voter approval requirement was set in place so that the big corporations could, spend lots of money defeating any proposal to let municipalities provide a service. Heaven forbid. There has been talk about repealing that law because the voter approval requirement is an impediment, and I would favor the repeal of that law. And it was actually my predecessor, Jennifer Vega, who was the sponsor of that law. So, just a little bit of interesting trivia.
Yeah.
Let me clarify that.
Sure.
In my own mind, you're saying that less public participation means more likely that we'll get better public.
Well, actually, that's a very good question, and you've caught me in that. I think local governments and city councils should be able to decide whether or not they want to invest in the infrastructure to make all of downtown Denver a hotspot, for instance, and have Wi-Fi free for everyone. I trust the city council to have public participation and input into that. I don't think it's necessarily the kind of thing you have to put to a vote, and we have to have a referendum on it before it can happen. And that's, that putting things to a vote, it sounds very democratic, but it's often a procedural requirement that's put in place with the intent that it be an impediment. So, I have a story I want to share, and I don't want to take too much time. As you know, I serve on the Joint Budget Committee, and you've probably been reading a little bit about some of the things going on in the legislature around the budget process this year. Our Budget Committee is split right down the middle, 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats, because we have a split legislature. And we've had a couple of high-profile 3-3 tie votes where we can't make a decision. And interestingly, the two that are really kind of flaring up at the moment both involve programs where users pay a fee to access the government service, and then we use that, what we call cash fund revenue. It's not tax dollars, it's fees that people have paid to fund the operation of the program. And we're going through right now what we call our supplemental appropriation cycle. Every year we do mid-year adjustments to the budget. A lot of that is caseload driven because we have the enrollment count in the public school. We've got a better census of how many prisoners in the state prisons. And so we go through and true up appropriations. And part of what we do in this supplemental process, when you've got unanticipated demand for certain services, and there's a backlog, a waiting list, we will provide extra resources to address that demand. And for a program that is cash funded, where a user pays a fee, it's usually pretty easy to authorize the spending of the fees to provide the service and to hire some temporaries if we have to speed things up. Well, you probably saw the headlines in the Denver Post this week about the concealed weapon permit process. In order to have a concealed weapon in Colorado, you have to go through a permitting process. You go through a background check. You have to submit documentation that you've been to a gun safety course and you've had training on how to handle a firearm and be safe with one hidden in your purse or in your pocket. And when you have all your paperwork in order, you send it in and you send it to your sheriff. They send it to the state. A background is done by the CBI, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. And that application comes with a check. People put their check in the envelope and send it in, and so we've got your money. We've cashed your check, but we're not willing to hire the extra people to speed up the process and address the backlog. The Budget Committee voted 3-3 tie vote on whether or not to use available funds that have already come in, because we've already cashed people's checks, to speed up the process and address the backlog, because right now people are waiting between 45 and 55 days to get their concealed weapon permit turned around.
Which group went which way?
Republicans voted no, and Democrats voted yes. Now, that may seem kind of odd, but let me explain to you the backstory, because this little vignette, I think, tells you a whole lot about what's going on at the Capitol this year. The Republican majority in the Senate, all of my colleagues, are pushing a bill this year, and it actually passed the Senate day before yesterday, Senate Bill 32, to make concealed weapon permits optional. You could just start carrying a concealed weapon, inside your jacket without a permit, without a background check, without any gun safety training. Just do it if you want to. Now, truth be told, this is really more of an ideological stand on principle. The fiscal analysis that gets performed on any piece of legislation tells us that 90% of concealed weapon permit holders will not forfeit their permit or fail to renew it. Only about 10% of the people are going to go permit-less. And the reason is because Colorado has reciprocity agreements with other states that recognize our permits, so that if you get a permit in Colorado, it's good in Kansas, it's good in Wyoming, it's good in a lot of other states. So 90% of people are not going to take advantage of permits being optional. That's why I say this is largely, a symbolic, ideological kind of vote that we're having. But the Republicans really feel that it's your God-given right to carry a gun concealed wherever you want to without any government interference, without any background checks or safety training requirements. And they are so adamant that concealed weapon permits are a bad idea that they're blocking the funding to address the backlog of all the law-abiding people that have written their check and sent in their money to get their permits. And we're having this partisan throwdown over whether or not we can spend the money that people have already written checks to the state of Colorado for to access a certain service, whether we can spend it now, hire temporary workers to come in and deal with the backlog in this program. And it's really more about their principled stand, if you will, on permits than their opposition to government efficiency, but they've taken a position in opposition to government efficiency. This coming week,
some people think the citizens are cynical for no reason.
well, this coming week we're going to go through the same thing again with the issue about driver's licenses for undocumented people or people that just have temporary visas. This was a law that passed a couple years ago, allows undocumented or people with visas, any of these folks to get a driver's license or a Colorado ID card. They've got to pay a special fee to go through an identity check and verification process, and then they pay the regular fee to get a driver's license. Well, we didn't anticipate how popular this program was going to be, and there are people standing in line literally wanting appointments to go through the identity verification process, and they're all paying $50.50 in fees just to go through the identity verification process. Once again, there's been a budget request to hire temporary workers and address the backlog, and we're going to use the fee money that these folks have paid to do this. And because of their opposition to the program, my Republican colleagues on the Budget Committee locked down in a partisan vote and said no, and we're at a partisan impasse over whether or not to use money that's available that came from citizens or residents who are willing to pay for the service. It's their money, and they're the ones paying it, wanting to be served by a program that's on the books, and the law says you can get a driver's license if you go through all these hoops and pay your fee. And we've run into this partisan roadblock, and it's a little distressing to see the ability to block things turn into the ability to defund and sort of shut down some government functions. And it's been a bit distressing for those of us that have been around for a little while. It's not the normal course. I mean, usually we will compromise, usually we will try to work out a deal at some point, and yet an effort to go to conference committee on this a couple days ago was rejected in the Senate. There's a really great editorial in the Denver Post yesterday morning on this issue. I've been very outspoken just about how this really isn't the collaborative, cooperative kind of working relationship that I think constituents want to see us have in the legislature. And I'm hoping that when we get to the driver's license issue next week, we've been told that the Republicans are planning on playing their hand a little differently this time and not being quite as brusque and shutting things down. But we'll see what happens. But I like this story just because I think this gives you a good look, one, inside of some of the stuff I'm dealing with day to day, what I'm doing on your behalf at the State House, but also just what divided government sometimes looks like and how it sometimes works. I know some folks think it's a good thing or there's a virtue in divided government, but there's also a real risk of stalemate and impasse. And unfortunately, not everybody wants to rise to the occasion to try to compromise and negotiate and work our way through these things. I want to take a couple questions, but before I do that, I've got my clipboard here. If any of you are not on my email newsletter, now is the time to get on. It's Oscar weekend, and every year I do a special Oscars edition of my email newsletter, and it's one of my snarkiest, cattiest things I do all year. It's always very entertaining, and I would encourage you to get on the list before Monday. So if anybody needs to sign up. And then also, for those of you that do live in Senate District 31, if you're a member of the Central Committee, today is our reorganization meeting at 1:30 at the Virginia Vale Library. And so far, so good. The roads are dry. But there is a concern about whether or not we're going to have a quorum. So if you're supposed to be there and you were thinking maybe that staying home and baking cookies or something sounded better, come on down to the library and help be part of the District 31 reorg. Brittany.
Two technical processing questions. I've never really quite understood if the JVC does vote tie on supplementals. What happens? Do you have two different versions?
No. The question is what happens when there's a tie vote? The Joint Budget Committee has 6 members, and right now it's 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. What happens when there's a tie? And the short answer is motions fail on a tie vote. And so whenever we were trying to put into a bill to adjust appropriations for a program, it doesn't get into the bill. And that's why we've introduced these bills without solving the driver's license problem or the concealed weapon permit problem. And in the Senate, we've been unable to fix it. And when the bills go over to the House, the Democratic majority in the House has amended those bills to fix the issue. And then they're sending them back to the Senate. And so far, the Senate Republicans have refused to negotiate. And we're going to see how that plays out next week. But that's how we get into this mess. A tie vote does not decide the issue.
And then my second question, because these are cash funds, which I've come to know a lot about lately.
Mm-hmm.
If we're not, are we spending all the cash fund? Are we building up a huge reserve in those 2 items you've mentioned because there's a backlog, or
well,
are we spending
no,
money?
actually, the backlog is for people waiting for the service. There's not enough money there's money in the fund in the driver's license case, or no, I'm sorry, in the CCW permit case. And that's because people send a check in with their application, so we're cashing their check up front before we provide the service. With the driver's license, you make an appointment and go in with all your documents to have your identity verified, and you pay your fee at the point you have an appointment. And so in that case, we don't have their money in the bank yet, but it's readily available. We would be walking in the door every day if we had the capacity to serve those folks. But with the concealed weapon permits, we've already cashed their checks.
Well, I know
and there are the cash funds, they don't have huge balances.
Okay.
There are limits under state law as to how much excess, 16.5% excess fund balance you can have in a cash fund. And the reason for that is because all of this revenue, whether it's people paying for a concealed weapon permit or people paying for a driver's license, or when you buy a hunting license or a fishing license, all that revenue counts against our Tabor limit. And right now we're over the Tabor limit. And if we're taking in a lot of extra money that we're not putting to good use, that money's sitting around while good money is going out the door as a refund. That makes no sense. That's another complication and the reason why we really ought to fix this. Yeah.
I have a question. In your opinion, what's the root cause for the divisiveness in the Senate right now? Is it primarily ideologic, or is it based off of special interest groups from the opposing side? What is it stemming from?
I mean, the dynamic in the Senate right now is kind of interesting. You have to realize the Democrats had the majority for the past decade. And the Republicans that are now in control, most of them were there 2 years ago in 2013 when a lot of people said the Democrats did a whole lot of things in 2013 that the Republicans really resented. That's when we passed the gun laws. That's when we passed the asset law. That's when we passed renewable energy laws, election reform, civil unions. You know, there were a lot of things that happened in 2013 that the Republican majority now in the Senate really resents. And they are going to do what they can to, you know, push all of their ideological agenda, you know, rub our noses in it. I mean, we've had gun bills going through. We've passed bills out of the Senate to lower the renewable energy standard. We've just had a whole series of bad bills moving through the Senate. Now, I can assure you, my colleagues in the House are going to take care of this for us. But some of it is just payback, and some of it is, you know, a little bit of grudge match, and they've got some things to prove. And they also have constituencies that they have things to prove too, like the gun issue is a great example. You know, there's a lot of folks that they riled up a whole lot over the past 2 years and did a lot of work in the last election, who are mad about laws that we passed around gun safety. And they have some debt to pay to their base, and they're going to push the repeal of every gun law they can, at least through the Senate. None of it's going to get through the House. And so some of this is all political theater, posturing for the next election. Chris.
Back to the previous question about voting at the JBC. What if one member has to step out, say for a photo op? How does that?
Okay, and actually, when we did the driver's license the first time, one of my Democratic colleagues from the House was absent, because one of the things we do at the very beginning of each new General Assembly is we all sit for our official state portraits, and you know, it goes on the wall in the chamber, or you know, in the building. They do those composites of all the House and Senate members. So one person was there, and that meant there were 5 of us still in the room. We still had a quorum, and the motion failed 3-2. Had he been there, the motion would have failed 3-3. And so it really didn't make that big of a difference. I can tell you, though, we had a vote earlier this week on something that the Democrats wanted, where we were increasing the funding for, I believe, something in the public health budget, and it passed 3-2 because one of the Republicans was out of the room. And so that happens sometimes. Now, I know for a fact that the Republican that was missing that day would have been a yes vote and would have voted with the Democrats. So far, every kind of close vote we've had on the JBC, it's either been a 3-3, you know, stalemate, or one of the Republicans has joined the 3 of us Democrats to do some decent things in the budget, and whether that's around public health or, you know, we're going to have a vote on Monday on the family planning request that the governor's put forward for a $5 million investment in long-acting reversible contraception. That we have a Republican vote to give us a 4-2 majority on the JBC to approve that. So that's been the story of a lot of things that we have been getting done in the Joint Budget Committee this year. There's been 1 or 2 Republicans that have crossed over and joined the Democrats. So far, we have not seen a vote where one of the Democrats crossed over and joined the Republicans to give them a majority. But it's possible, and it's likely to happen before the end of the year. That's part of the give and take. I can get in the hook. I see the clipboard going around. Great to see you all. Have a nice snowy weekend, and if you're coming to the reorg, we'll make sure you get to hear the story again, probably.